Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Coffin, CEO of Maritime Logistics at this Tristar group based here in Dubai. Tim, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dell.
Great to have you. Well, let's get stuck in. I mean, lots to talk about on maritime logistics. A lot of obviously shifts and changes in the last 2 or 3 years. That's so dynamic as usual, and the maritime sector rarely isn't. But it really has been a very intense time, hasn't it, with rerouting of trade flows and particularly energy trade flows as well, which is our focus on this program. Let me start by asking you, it's a bigger picture question, and whether the current sort of dynamics in the tariff talk and the back and forth between the US and various countries are, do you think that the different sort of country stakeholders in that are already thinking ahead in terms of what that's going to do to their shipping routes beyond what we've already seen in the last couple of years because of Ukraine, Russia, Suez, etc.?
Yeah. Well, certainly there are moves afoot by the U.S. administration, which you allude to refashion some aspects of world trade in a way that benefits U.S. foreign policy. And we've seen some activity already moving very quickly, for example, in the transfer of some of the port holdings on either end of the Panama Canal to non-Chinese entities. And more broadly, it's likely that that trend will continue. In shipping, we tend to be apolitical. We don't really care who sits in the back of our taxi, so to speak. But on the other hand, we have to follow the rules, and the rules are changing as we speak, both in terms of the regulation that we operate our industry under, and also some other aspects that are demanded by society, such as the requirement to decarbonize and various things like that. So, as you say, there are lots of things, lots of moving parts at the moment within our industry that historically we haven't had so much exposure to. So we're having to move fairly quickly to figure out how to handle these aspects.
Absolutely. I mean, one aspect of that has been, of course, the fleets and vessels that are handling sanctioned crude, for example, whether it's from Venezuela or from Russia, from Iran. And clearly that has led to a rerouting of some sort, with some countries still taking that sanctioned crude. And I mean, would you say the shipping sector has adjusted well to that? And would you see, if we have a change in the geopolitical dynamic, for example, a stable Middle East and no more threats to the shipping through Suez and Bab el-Mandab, where people have still sort of shied away from, would you see that shippers and owners of those ships would go back to previous routes, or have those new trends now been set, do you think?
Well, you're raising two separate issues. One is the element of sanctions imposed on, for example, Russia because of the Ukraine situation, and secondly, the physical threat of force that prevents freedom of navigation through the Suez. To address the sanctions issue first, it's not Russian crude that's sanctioned. It's Russian crude that's sanctioned above a certain price. And so ship owners can legally carry Russian crude provided that it's sold at a price that is below the so-called price cap. Now, there is a trade of sanctioned Russian crude, in other words, crude that is sold above the price cap. And lots of ships have entered this trade. We refer to it as the gray fleet or the dark fleet. And these vessels are essentially outside of the global trading system at this point. They're uninsured by Western insurers. They're not classed by an internationally recognized classification society, which means that they don't necessarily comply with the structural and maintenance rules that are demanded of most ocean-going vessels. So those vessels will have a very difficult time to re-enter the conventional fleet. And that will have a huge impact potentially on the way freight is moved for the existing tonnage. But freight markets are like water. They will find the easiest path to the sea. Uh, and and so when the market adjusts, typically our market adjusts very, very efficiently to address those changes. The one area where I hope we see movement soon is in the Red Sea. The Bab el-Mandeb, as you say, is constricted. We haven't sent a ship through Suez in a year and a half now, because of this physical threat of violence against our seafarers. And I don't.
Yeah, what would your
Sorry, go ahead.
expectation would be that it would continue to be one of caution, although we have seen that sort of calm down a bit in the last few months. Of course, it all depends on what's going to happen most immediately next with Iran, with the US, and what's happening. But with so that hesitation, from what I'm reading from you, is that it will remain until things are 100% okay.
You can never have 100%, but you can certainly get a lot more comfortable than we are today. And as soon as that happens, we've seen recent activity from the Trump administration in trying to mitigate that threat. Um, and maybe they'll be successful, and maybe they won't. But until there's a certain degree of peace, I think it's very unlikely that that trade will resume to its pre-threat levels. Now, what does that mean to global society? What does that mean to consumers at the end? What it means is that the consumer goods and the energy and the grains that are traveling from fairly far away potentially have to go around Africa instead of going through the Mediterranean. And if you're shipping oil, for example, from the Middle East to France, you can imagine that going all the way around Africa increases the cost of energy by a huge percentage. The impact of China to Europe, for example, is less so, but the consumer ultimately pays the price for this. And but as I say, as soon as there's we can be reasonably sure of that the threat is mitigated in the Bab el-Mandeb. I'm sure that we'll see a large increase in tonnage going through.
Okay, and I mean, but in the interim, like you said, I mean, the shipping industry the maritime sector is very flexible. It adjusts like water, as you said, but it does, though, impact the bottom line, doesn't it? It's still a cost. Some of it will be passed on to the consumer, but shippers, insurers, etc., with this uncertainty, do take on some sort of extra cost. And does that, do you think, impact the investment sort of thinking within shipping? You've got, for example, replacing old ships, repurposing ships. You mentioned the energy transition, newer, cleaner ships, all that investment that's going through to that. Do you think this sort of uncertainty in the market that will continue for the foreseeable is impacting sort of future, more medium-term investment into where the shipping sector would have otherwise gone in terms of new vessels and new types of ships that would be coming onto the market?
It doesn't necessarily affect the investment thesis, which
Mm.
is, do we experiment or do we test newer propulsion technologies? Uh, what it does do is perhaps catalyze those investments. And the reason why is because disruption is a source of, typically it's a source of greater income into our industry. Disruption is good for us because it typically requires ships to be less efficiently deployed or to go longer distances.
Hmm.
And less efficient deployment and longer distances effectively reduce the total available supply of tonnage on any one day for any new
Yes.
cargo. And what that means is the cost of moving that cargo goes up, which means that we have greater income coming into our industry, which means that we can make these investments a little bit faster than we might have been able to otherwise. So that's the impact. It's not so much that the trade patterns are changing. It's more the case that the costs of doing those trades is going up because ships have to go further.
Okay. And Tim, we mentioned, the dark fleet, the shadow fleet. Of course, for Russian barrels, for example, that $60 price cap that's still in place. Of course, as the oil price has softened a bit, that becomes easier for the Russians. Let's say they're not losing out as much, if you like, in
Yes.
terms of trying to secure a certain price and tonnage. But also, there's been a lot of talk about, well, who does the onus lie on? As you said, it's even the sanctioned vessels are getting around one way or another. There's, buyers like China, Iran are creating new companies, new payment mechanisms. one way or another, as you said, they're getting the oil as the ships also are adjusting themselves. But do you see then that will not change? There's been a lot of calling that we have to get stricter on the dark shadow fleet, that ports need to play a bigger role because ultimately there's a lot of switching on the way. Do you see that dynamic of control can change and become more stringent, or OFAC sanctions and all that is a waste of time, really?
Well, I think a lot of it is dependent on how the peace process plays out. Of course, I think most of us would agree that we'd like to see an end to this thing sooner rather than later. And I would guess that part of that settlement includes a relaxation of the price cap. That seems a natural consequence of any peace agreement. And the relaxation of the price agreement will bring internationally trading ships back into the Russian trade in a way that they weren't when the sanctions were imposed. So I think that's probably the consequence, rather than anything more sort of
Right.
industrial or politically driven.
Okay, you mentioned again back to the energy transition. What about the route, the forward for fuels? Cleaner fuels, biofuels, and shipping. There's even talk of hydrogen down the road.
Yeah.
Do you think again? With the IMO, with the directives that it's given thus far, what sort of should we be looking out for in the next sort of 2, 3 years? Again, we're looking more of at a medium-term outlook when it comes to new fuels, aren't we?
Yeah. Ship owners are a fairly conservative group of people,
Yes.
and naval architects are too, because if you have a ship that breaks down in the middle of the Pacific, you have a real problem. So we don't take risks very easily, and we don't put ourselves in a position where we might be caught out because we hoped it would work out and it didn't. Naval architecture, unfortunately, is an industry defined that advances through catastrophe oftentimes. So we've been experimenting with all these various new fuels. Typically, these days, you don't see a ship that's being built only to burn, for example, methanol, but you do see ships that are being built with so-called dual fuel engines. So they will burn conventional diesel as well as LNG or methanol or one of the other fuels that we're looking at. The last time there was a major shift in propulsion technology was when we went from sail to steam. So this is a long time coming. It's exciting to be in an industry that's making these changes now because, of course, it's dynamic and there's innovation going on in a way that you typically don't see. But we have to be very careful about how we do it. It isn't necessarily the case that all these fuels will prevail. Is LNG the right fuel for the future? Well, probably not. I mean, it's still a hydrocarbon. Is ammonia the fuel for the future? Well, on paper, yes, except that it's highly toxic. And so how do we handle that risk? Is methanol the right solution? Well, it costs the cost of producing it in terms of emissions can be higher than the emissions that it saves. So each of these fuels has a challenge, and we're working through it.
Yeah, but working through it. So how would you rate the level of cooperation on that? Of course, this is a global issue, isn't it? Just like, COP, and at the COP meetings, you're trying to get several hundred countries agreeing on a target. It's not always that
Yeah.
easy, is it?
Yeah.
How realistic is it we'll see progress on that front, do you think, in the next few years? What would
Well,
be the
we're
main
seeing progress
obstacles?
now. I think it's generally the case society requires of us to emit fewer harmful gases. And we're as an industry, we're very on side with that. Tristar, for example, is building a coastal tanker which is electric power. It's got a battery on deck, and that's a fairly new concept for our industry. And some of us have the ability and the bandwidth to be able to take these challenges on. They're not so easy as just ordering a ship that has a different fuel system. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
and you have to get all the stakeholders involved and aligned, and because it's a collective risk that all these disparate parties are taking. Most importantly, our clients, who are ultimately paying for it. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned batteries. In terms of the sort of new tech, new innovation to run ships for for HSE, for efficiencies, and safety, optimizing logistics at the end of the day. Battery power is one of them. What would you see as sort of the next thing on the horizon, which ships are sort of would like to target if it becomes obviously economically feasible to do so?
In terms of fuel, you
No, in
mean?
terms of technology, really, and operational sort of tech AI, deploying AI into your
Hmm.
shipping, into sort of efficiencies, data handling, on the seas, not so much the fuel, but the sort of, I
Right.
suppose, the software, soft systems that might be running.
Yeah. Well, ships have generated a lot of digital data for many years. The the reason why we don't necessarily have it on shore is because the ability to transmit that data to shore has been quite expensive until really very recently. At Tristar, we've been installing Starlink terminals on our ships. So we have much more bandwidth than we used to have. And what that means is that we can start looking at the ships and almost on a minute by minute basis. We can look at fuel consumption, we can look at efficiencies, we can look at what's going on with specific valves here and there and through the engine room.
Yeah.
And obviously all the navigational data as well. So we now have almost too much data. And the question is, what do we do with it? How do you parse and evaluate the data in order to glean uh, business knowledge? And that's a challenge, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
If you have a problem on a ship, then the guys ashore can now dig into those problems in a way that they couldn't previously. But that doesn't necessarily translate into a business decision-making benefit.
Okay, not yet anyway.
Not
What
yet.
about, I wanted to ask you, Tim, as we sort of start to wrap up, in terms of routes, we have obviously the traditional routes for energy flows and for general trade. We've talked about the challenges of Suez and Bab el Mandab, and obviously there's now a new, around the Cape of Good Hope, etc.
Yeah.
It has been a lot of talk about the Arctic, the new sort of Arctic advantage of shipping routes, in terms of North Atlantic, and
Yeah.
particularly relevant in the context of Trump's current rhetoric about Greenland, and not Greenland itself, but I mean that part of the world. And you mentioned the Panama Canal at the beginning of our interview here. Would you say those new sort of Arctic routes, the other sort of northern rather than southern, between east and west, are going to take shape? Is there something that would spur them on faster than normal? What would your viewpoint be on that?
We refer to it as the Northern Sea Route, and the Northern Sea Route is a function of sea ice. If there's a lot of sea
Yes,
ice, it's closed, and if there
but
isn't
that's
much
why
sea
it's
ice, it's
opening,
open.
right? Because that's sort of
Exactly.
giving way.
Exactly.
Mm.
Yeah. And what I would guess, or what I would term sort of experimental, politically motivated cargoes go through. But we haven't really seen it open up to broad navigation. And I don't expect we will anytime soon because I think there are political considerations there that would prevent the Northern Sea Route from becoming a major trade passage.
Okay. And Tim, just one last question on, again, back to sort of, I mentioned the IMO earlier, but in
Hmm.
terms of, sort of the international cooperation, but regulation, we see obviously there is a broad umbrella of regulation, obviously for the ships, for shipping and maritime logistics. But how much of a challenge do you think that is in terms of going forward, regulating on obviously environmental issues or otherwise? Is that a I suppose an exercise that's becoming easier or more difficult as we see these shifts in the sort of geopolitical alignment, if you like, and cooperation? I mean, we are seeing some massive shifts in the Western Alliance, to put it one way, the global South growth. Do you think that regulation of this very international industry is going to get easier or harder?
Much more onerous. Uh, and that can be a good thing and that can be a bad thing. But let me give you an example. Usually regulation results in some form of taxation or some sort of economic contribution by the entity being regulated, let's say. And usually that comes in the form of a tax. The way it's happening in shipping in Europe, for example, is through
Mm.
the so-called Fuel EU set of regulations and the European emissions credits and things like that. So depending on how much harmful gases you emit from in your exhaust, you have to pay a fee based on the per ton emission. Um, and so that's relatively new. I think that kicked in January, and it becomes slightly more onerous over the next few years. as it becomes fully embedded across the industry. And we're seeing that in other areas also, that type of behavior. I think it's becoming a cost of doing business. It's new for us because ship owners are not typically in the business of dealing with local taxes or even regional taxes. So it's a new set of obligations for us that we have to comply with. It's the price of doing business. Ultimately, again, it's the consumer who has to fund it. And it's one of those things. Live with it.
Live with it. Tim Coffin, CEO of Maritime Logistics at the Tristar Group. Thanks so much for joining us today
Thank you,
on
Dial.
Halftime
It's been
Talk.
a
It's been
pleasure to be
great
here.
to have your views on this very dynamic sector. Thanks so much for joining
Thanks so
us.
much.